When most people picture World War II, they imagine soldiers, trenches, and smoke-filled skies. But the first battle lines were drawn far closer to home, in kitchens, gardens, and the quiet corners of ordinary streets. Entire families became guardians of survival long before the first siren wailed. They blacked out their windows, stored water in tin bathtubs, and whispered plans in case. Tomorrow vanished overnight. Every knock on the door could mean orders, news, or loss. Yet beneath that constant unease, something remarkable happened. Fear turned into vigilance. Neighbors became networks. Caution became courage. They didn't wait for rescue. They prepared for impact, and while history remembers generals and invasions, it often forgets the mothers, mapping escape routes by candlelight, or the children, learning to stay silent in the dark. These unseen defenders built a fortress not of steel, but of awareness, proving that security isn't born from strength alone, but from ordinary people, refusing to be unready when the world tilts toward chaos, when the threat of invasion loomed over entire continents. Homes became more than shelter, they became strategy. In Britain, blackout curtains turned every window into a shield against enemy bombers. Basements were reinforced with sandbags and steel doors scavenged from scrap yards. Families dug trenches in their gardens and turned cellars into miniature bunkers lined with blankets, ration tins, and candles stubbed halfway down. Children learned that darkness was safety, and silence was survival. Across Europe, creativity became the new defense industry. A father might hide his valuables, or his neighbors, behind false walls. A mother could rig a cooking fire to vent through a chimney already cold, fooling distant patrols into thinking the house was abandoned. The layout of a kitchen could become a tactic. Tools hung within arm's reach, exits mapped by habit. These weren't acts of paranoia. They were quiet rehearsals for chaos. Every nail driven, every curtain pinned tight, carried a message. If war came to the doorstep, it would not find helplessness waiting. It would find ingenuity. Ordinary people turning fear into architecture and survival into a kind of art. Long before radar screens glowed in command centers, the human eye was the first line of defense. Across towns and coastlines, civilians became watchmen. Housewives noted aircraft patterns as they hung laundry. Farmers tracked distant engine sounds across the fields. Fishermen from the decks of quiet harbors learned to read the horizon for silhouettes that didn't belong. They passed their findings in whispers, in coded notes, in the careful rhythm of ordinary conversation. What looked like gossip was often intelligence. In villages, church bells had meanings only locals understood. A pattern for an approaching convoy, a signal to hide, or a call to prepare. Children, sworn to secrecy, carried messages folded into paper cranes or tied beneath their sleeves. None of them wore uniforms, but all of them served. Their greatest weapon wasn't a gun. It was trust. Trust that their neighbor would watch their back as fiercely as they watched the sky. In a world where silence could mean survival, the simplest forms of communication became the most powerful. Proof that vigilance doesn't always come from authority, but from community bound by purpose. In wartime, readiness wasn't paranoia, it was patriotism. Across cities and villages, entire nations trained not just soldiers but citizens. Posters urged families to keep gas masks by the door, to know the nearest shelter, to ration food not for themselves but for victory. Schoolyards became drill grounds where children learned to duck, cover, and count breaths in the dark. Housewives practiced extinguishing incendiary bombs with sand before the flames could swallow a roof. Factory workers volunteered after shifts, forming neighborhood watch patrols, armed with flashlights and whistles instead of rifles. Every household had its role. Every precaution was an act of loyalty. To be prepared was to be brave. There was no shame in fear, only in doing nothing. Even the smallest gestures carried meaning. A jar of preserves labeled for emergency use, a carefully folded blanket kept by the stairs, a hand-painted sign pointing to a communal shelter. These weren't luxuries of comfort, but symbols of unity, proof that a nation's strength begins long before the battlefield. They understood something we often forget, that defense isn't built by governments alone, but by millions of ordinary people choosing awareness over denial and courage over convenience. Survival in war wasn't just about bunkers or supplies, it was about the mind. When the world above trembled with air raids, the greatest strength was often found in the quiet below. In shelters crowded with strangers, calm became contagious. One person's steady voice could silence panic faster than any command. Parents learned to smile through fear so their children would not see it. Even when sirens screamed and dust fell from ceilings, people recited poems, shared jokes, or sang softly just to remind themselves that noise could mean life, not death. Psychologists would later call it resilience. They called it getting through the night. They rationed emotions as carefully as they rationed food. No room for despair, only endurance. And when morning came, they swept the debris, brewed tea over makeshift stoves, and carried on as if normal had never left. Their composure was not denial. It was defiance. They proved that control begins inside, long before it's seen outside. Today, when chaos arrives in different forms, digital, financial, environmental, their lesson still stands. The calmest person in the room isn't the one untouched by fear, but the one who remembers it's possible to stand firm inside the storm. History remembers weapons, but it often forgets the quiet tools that kept people alive. In World War II, innovation wasn't born in laboratories. It grew in backyards and basements. Families created decentralized systems long before the term existed. One neighbor stored extra water, another held medical supplies, and together they formed invisible safety nets. When phone lines failed, messages traveled by bicycle or flashlight signal, each flash a promise that no one was forgotten. Blackout drills taught entire streets to vanish on command, curtains drawn tight, fires dimmed, every window sealed against unwanted eyes. Even gardens were strategic. Cabbages and carrots grown behind fences, doubled as camouflage for supply caches. Households mapped escape routes through alleys and rooftops, memorized by heart rather than written down. Each adaptation served a single purpose: to make chaos survivable. And while their tools were simple, their principles were eternal: redundancy, cooperation, discretion. In an age where we depend on glowing screens and fragile systems, those wartime methods still speak. A neighborhood that knows how to communicate without power, to share without panic, to plan without noise. That's not nostalgia. That's wisdom rediscovered. The technology may change, but the oldest defense remains the same: awareness, shared and steady, in the hands of ordinary people who refused to be caught unprepared. When the war finally ended, few medals were given to the people who had guarded the home front, yet their quiet heroism left a deeper mark than history books could hold. They were the watchful mothers who turned fear into vigilance, the fathers who fortified walls with nothing but will, the children who learned that courage doesn't always march. Sometimes it hides and waits. These were the ordinary defenders, and their legacy is not buried in museums. It lives in the instincts we still carry. Every time we stock an emergency kit, check on a neighbor, or plan for the unexpected, we echo their wisdom. They taught that defense begins not with weapons, but with awareness, not with force, but with foresight. Today, comfort has made us forget how fragile security truly is. But their stories remind us that preparedness is not paranoia. It is respect for the unpredictable nature of the world and for the people who stand beside us when it shifts. The lessons of the past aren't relics of fear. They're blueprints of resilience. And if another dark hour ever comes, we won't need to reinvent courage. We'll only need to remember where we left it, in the hands of those who never stopped defending home.